The image of Nicolás Maduro in handcuffs wasn't justice. It wasn't a drug bust. It certainly wasn't about democracy. It was a foreclosure. When the U.S. moved to arrest a sitting head of state, the media called it a victory for rule of law. But if you looked at the stock markets in Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia that morning, they weren't celebrating. They were freezing, because the message sent to the Western Hemisphere was brutal and unmistakable. The Monroe Doctrine is back, and this time we aren't asking. The Venezuela operation was the violent return of the American sphere of influence. But if you think this stops at the Caribbean, you haven't been looking north. You haven't been looking east. This is the Gilded Archives, where the arrest of one leader signals the reclamation of an entire hemisphere. The records show a doctrine that was supposed to be dead, the Monroe Doctrine, the idea that the Americas are the American backyard. The idea has been dormant for 150 years. It just woke up. Most people think the doctrine died in the 1800s. The archives show it never died. It was sleeping. Look at the map. To the south, the U.S. just decapitated the Venezuelan government for flirting with China. But look north. Why is the president talking about buying Greenland again? Why are there threats to secure the Arctic? The media laughed when the proposal came. Stop laughing. Greenland is full of rare earth minerals. Greenland is the gatekeeper to Arctic shipping lanes. The U.S. isn't trying to buy an island. The U.S. is trying to close the gates. The strategy is unmistakable. Fortress America. Secure the north. Secure the south. Lock out China. The hemisphere is being locked down. The architecture of the new enforcement has 3 layers. First, the decapitation in the south. When a nation in the American hemisphere attempts to trade with China, the response is now explicit. Venezuela tried to sell oil in yuan. Venezuela tried to launch an oil-backed cryptocurrency. Venezuela attempted to trade outside the system. The U.S. didn't invade militarily. The U.S. arrested the head of state. The legal framework is complex. The message is simple. If you're in the Americas and you trade with our enemies, your government disappears. By arresting Maduro on narcotics charges, the U.S. was technically following law. By arresting a sitting head of state over charges that would be prosecuted in American courts, the U.S. was asserting sovereignty over the entire hemisphere. The arrest said, you don't rule your own country. We do. The arrest said, your election doesn't matter, your laws don't matter, only our permission matters. Second, the gating of resources in the north. Greenland contains rare earth minerals critical for technology and semiconductors. Greenland controls Arctic shipping routes that bypass Suez and Panama. If the U.S. controls Greenland, the U.S. controls the alternate routes that China and Russia might use to bypass American choke points. The proposal to buy Greenland appears absurd. The archives show it's perfectly logical. The U.S. is attempting to consolidate control of physical geography. Suez connects the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. Panama connects the Atlantic to the Pacific. If America controls both canals, America controls global shipping. If America adds Greenland and Arctic routes, America has backup passages. The consolidation is geographic. The purpose is absolute control. Third, the strangulation of enemies abroad. Iran sells oil. China needs oil. The U.S. has threatened to physically blockade the Straits of Hormuz for any ship carrying Iranian oil to China. This is the same playbook as Venezuela, just on a larger scale. Venezuela was the demonstration. Iran is the chokehold. The U.S. is attempting to prevent China from accessing energy anywhere. If China can't access Iranian oil, Chinese oil sources are limited. If China can't access Venezuelan oil, the limitation increases. If China can't access Russian oil, the limitation becomes absolute. The strategy is to cut off every energy source that might serve China. The purpose is to force China into dependency or submission. The data reveals the consolidation with precision. The arrest of Maduro triggered immediate capital flight from emerging markets. Emerging market bond yields increased 200 basis points in the week following the arrest. Capital fled Mexico, Brazil, and Colombia. The capital fled because investors realized sovereignty in the Americas is conditional. If your government makes the wrong trade deal, your government disappears. If your government disappears, your bonds become worthless. The realization caused immediate repricing. Emerging market risk increased, capital returned to American assets. The arrest created a flight to safety. The flight to safety was the point. The arrest wasn't just about Venezuela. The arrest was about forcing capital allocation away from the periphery back to the core. The comparison to historical hegemony reveals the mechanism. In 1823, when Monroe announced the doctrine, America had no military capacity to enforce it. America had no navy. America had no army that could defeat European powers. But Monroe announced anyway. The announcement was a claim. Over 150 years, America built the capacity to enforce the claim. By 1945, America had the strongest military. By 1974, America had the strongest currency. By 2000, America had absolute hegemonic power. For 50 years, the power was exercised quietly. The U.S. didn't need to arrest sitting heads of state. The threat was implicit. By 2025, the threat has become explicit. The explicit threat signals that the implicit threat is no longer sufficient. The implicit threat loses power when it's not believed. The explicit exercise of power is necessary to restore belief. The arrest of Maduro is the demonstration that the implicit threat is now explicit. Every nation in the hemisphere watched the arrest. Every nation understood the message. Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, Colombia, Peru, all are attempting to balance between American pressure and BRICS opportunity. The arrest made the calculation impossible. BRICS offers trade in yuan and an alternative to the dollar. America offers arrest. The choice appears simple. The choice is actually impossible because the trade is conditional on American permission. Brazil thought it could trade with China and America simultaneously. The arrest demonstrated it can't. Brazil is now freezing. The freezing is political. The market is repricing. Emerging market assets are becoming toxic. Strategic resources in stable jurisdictions are becoming valuable. The architect of this new enforcement is the Trump administration's return to explicit hegemony. For 20 years, America attempted to maintain hegemony through consensus. The consensus worked when America was powerful enough that the cost of resistance was higher than the cost of compliance. By 2020, the cost calculation had changed. China had grown. Russia had consolidated. BRICS had formed. The cost of resistance had declined. The consensus was breaking. The arrest signals a return to explicit enforcement. The Trump administration is abandoning the consensus model. The Trump administration is restoring the hierarchy model. The hierarchy model requires visible demonstrations of power. The arrest of Maduro is the demonstration. The threat to buy Greenland is the threat. The threats to Iran are the threats. The explicit enforcement restores belief in the implicit threat. Every time you buy emerging market bonds, you engage with this mechanism. You believe the bonds will return your investment because the government will be stable. The arrest of Maduro has revealed that stability is conditional on American approval. If the government makes a trade deal America doesn't like, the government disappears. Your bonds become worthless. You're no longer investing in the nation's future. You're betting on American permission. Most investors haven't recalculated the odds. Most investors still believe emerging market bonds are stable. The archives show they're not. The stability is conditional. The condition is obedience. But there's a second layer the records reveal. The world is fragmenting into two blocks. Block A is the American fortress. North America, South America by force, and Western Europe. Dollar-dominated, resource secure, locked down. Block B is the Eurasian Block. China, Russia, Iran, desperate for resources, trying to build a gold-backed system to survive the sanctions. The volatility comes from the friction between the blocks. Every nation in the middle, Saudi Arabia, India, Turkey, is about to be forced to choose. The arrest demonstrates what happens if they choose wrong. The markets haven't priced this in. The markets are still worrying about interest rates. The markets should be worrying about empire. When the U.S. decides to revive the Monroe Doctrine, capital flows change direction. Liquidity leaves the gray zones and floods back to the core. Emerging market bonds become toxic. Strategic resources in safe jurisdictions become valuable. We are at stage 6 of the hegemonic enforcement consolidation pattern. Stage 1 was Monroe announcing the doctrine in 1823 without capacity to enforce it. Stage 2 was America building military capacity in the 1900s. Stage 3 was America building economic power in the 1940s. Stage 4 was America maintaining hegemony through implicit threat in the 1970s to 2000s. Stage 5 was the breakdown of consensus as alternatives emerged in the 2000s. Stage 6, where we are now, is the return to explicit enforcement. The arrest of Maduro is the signal. Stage 7, which comes next, is the complete bifurcation. By 2027, the world will have divided explicitly into two competing systems. By 2030, the middle ground will have disappeared. Every nation will be forced to choose. By 2035, the two systems will be competing directly for dominance. The outcome will determine global structure for the next 50 years. The three paths forward require acknowledging the bifurcation's reality. First, accept American hegemony, comply with the system, trade through American infrastructure, settle in dollars, accept American authority over your nation's trade relationships. The benefit is security. Nations that comply don't face arrest or sanctions. The cost is sovereignty. Your government doesn't make trade decisions. America does. Most nations would choose security over sovereignty if offered explicitly. Most don't realize they've made that choice because the choice was framed as inevitable. Second, resist through the Eurasian Block. Join BRICS, accumulate gold reserves, build alternative payment systems, reject the dollar, create energy partnerships with Russia and China, This path is available to large nations with resources. It's not available to small nations dependent on American markets. The resistance is possible, but requires complete separation from the American system. Third, position by understanding which nations will survive the bifurcation. Nations with energy independence will survive. Nations with food production will survive. Nations with manufacturing will survive. Nations dependent on American imports and American markets will be forced to choose American hegemony. The choice is determined by productive capacity, not by political ideology. Geographic position matters. Resource endowment matters. Economic independence matters. The deeper protection lies in what the archives show always survives imperial reorganization, direct ownership of productive assets in multiple jurisdictions. When hegemonies collapse and reorganize, individuals and institutions that own productive capacity in multiple systems survive. Land in America and land in China. Business in the American system and business in the BRICS system. Energy assets in the Western Hemisphere and energy assets in Eurasia. The consolidation requires you to choose a side. The protection is to own assets on both sides so that when one collapses, the other survives. The pattern says what comes next. The arrest of Maduro is the opening shot. By 2027, when the next Latin American government attempts to trade with China, the response will be faster and more severe. By 2030, the Western Hemisphere will be firmly locked under American control. By 2035, the Eurasian Block will have consolidated under Chinese leadership. The middle ground will have disappeared. The world will have divided. The outcome was determined when America decided that implicit hegemony was no longer sufficient. The arrest made it explicit. The world is now reorganizing around the explicit hierarchy. You watch the arrest of Maduro. The media calls it justice. The markets call it what it actually is, a demonstration of power. The arrest wasn't about removing a dictator. Every authoritarian government has American support. The arrest was about reasserting American authority over a hemisphere. The arrest was about forcing every nation in the Americas to choose, obey, or disappear. The arrest worked perfectly. Capital is already fleeing emerging markets. Capital is already returning to American assets. The mechanism is working. The message was received. The hemisphere is learning. If this pattern revealed something you'd never seen before, subscribe to the Gilded Archives. History's records reveal how empires enforce control and how that control eventually breaks. The Monroe Doctrine isn't unique. It's one iteration of a pattern that repeats across centuries. Understanding it allows you to see the pattern in the next hemispherical reorganization, the next arrest that signals broader change, the next consolidation of explicit authority. The records are specific. The mechanism repeats. The outcomes are predictable. We're just watching it unfold.